Hello and welcome everybody to Getting APIs to Work. Today we say hello to Derek Gilling of Moesif. Hey Derek, how are you doing?
Doing great. Thanks for having me here, Eric.
Thanks for joining. Derek is a co-founder and CEO of Moesif, and what we want to talk about today is a playbook for monetizing APIs because we see that a lot of companies are trying to do that. I think everybody in the API space always gets a lot of questions around how do I make money with APIs, so to speak. And we just want to go through a couple of the important things that you have to think about, discuss a couple of pitfalls, and I think Derek has some really great insights there. To start things off, Derek, just what's your experience when you talk to customers about API monetization? Like where is the thought process starting typically for them, and what kind of advice do you give them?
Sure, definitely. Before digging into any type of, pricing strategy or monetization strategy, it's always great to think about your developer persona. Who is actually going to be adopting these APIs? And from there, you can start building out a go-to-market strategy. And that might be top down, it might be bottoms up. But at the end of the day, selling to developers is hard. Um, there is no single developer persona. There's experienced developers. There's novice developers. Many times there's not invented here syndrome. They want to build it instead of actually buying an API. And then many times developers are skeptical of sales and marketing. Traditional outbound sales does not necessarily work when you're going after these type of developers. But the most important piece is that there's a lot of other stakeholders that are involved when making a purchase decision. It's not up to a developer that's integrating the API by itself. You have legal and security review, you have procurement, you have management, different priorities that are happening within the project itself. And so all of these different things are rolled up into when you think about these three different pillars. One, billing, the second piece is packaging, and the last piece is invoicing, which we can walk through later on.
I have one question because you were just talking about marketing, and I had a little while ago, I had Adam Duvander here for a little interview, and I don't know whether you've seen his book, which is called, I think, Developer Marketing Doesn't Exist or something like that. Have you seen that book?
I have. It's a great book on how to get developers to actually adopt a product and not push
And
it onto them.
yeah, it's funny, right? Because you were just talking about it's hard to market to them, and there's like, well, there are people who say it's impossible. Well, I mean, it's kind of a little bit, I would say, hyperbole that he's using there. But so you would kind of agree on the things that Adam is saying, that you really have to think through what you're doing because it's a specific customer population, so to speak, that you're talking to.
I definitely agree there. And one thing I love is leveraging things like inbound marketing. And what you're doing there is you're really trying to create that feeling where you discovered something. And a developer discovering a new tool, new guide, new skill is a much better feeling than having, some salesperson pushing a product onto them, because then there's no discovery. It's just you're following someone else's advice, which is not what a developer wants to do. They want to go to their manager saying, "Hey, I found something, I built something, and check it out. Maybe we should walk through
Okay.
it together."
Yeah, no, yeah. So there. I think there's a whole bunch of tricks like these that will help you um, a, a fair bit to target that particular um, customer segment. Now, you mentioned these three pillars that you should keep in mind. So let's assume you do have a good idea for an API that you want to monetize, and you have, let's say, a solid strategy in place how you're marketing that in some shape or form. Now, the first pillar that you were mentioning is billing. So what in that billing part would you say is really important? What matters? What maybe are the challenges for that?
The first area I would focus on is billing itself, which is prepaid billing versus postpaid billing, the two most common billing formats that we see today. And this has a huge impact on the onboarding flow and onboarding friction that you have. So, for example, if you do prepaid billing, you actually have a better cash flow for the business itself. You're able to collect those payments up front, And it's more familiar for, traditional enterprise agreements. If you sign up for a SaaS product or more just traditional UI product, usually it is prepaid billing. However, it does create a lot of onboarding friction, creates a lot of issues for developers. They're not ready to put in their credit card or pay for, something that they haven't seen value yet, because it takes time to integrate the API and actually see something of value. And what we've seen is that, some of these post-paid billing models you can leverage where, they don't do anything. You don't pay for anything. And then later on you get some bill, and that bill says, oh, you use, X widgets in the last month, or you use, Y transactions. And this actually fits, some of these newer pay-as-you-go models a lot better. But create some issues too, like, additional credit risk for the business. You're literally extending credit to your customers. So it can be abused depending on what your product is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess this abuse thing always is quite a big issue there. But then I guess it all depends also on how you design this postpaid model, right? Like when do you actually trigger the processes where people actually need to pay and these kind of things. So I guess it's manageable it's manageable risk, right? In the end.
It is. It is. I mean, usually if you're looking at, are you using the same credit card, sharing accounts, using different credit cards, like that type of stuff, you can put different gates and paywalls in the product in the right points to make sure
Mm-hmm.
that, you don't have someone signing up for 50 accounts and, using all their credits or something like that.
Okay, so my takeaway for the first pillar, the billing, then would be that postpaid probably is a little bit nicer. You just have to make sure that you manage it so that you don't create too much risk. Good.
Yep.
Okay, so then the next thing, which I guess is kind of connected with that, would be the packaging, right? So how do you actually charge for things in the way that what basically are people getting charged for when they're using your product? So what are the things that you are recommending for that second pillar of packaging?
Sure. And this is one of the most important areas that impacts revenue, and especially expansion revenue. And so a lot of it is aligned to your product strategy and how do you think about expansion. Is it when you want to expand account, is it a customer upgrading their enterprise plan? Are you looking for, a more usage-based approach where, there's natural expansion because of the way the API is designed? And so this means you're going to have to talk to the product team and make sure, the way you package your API is aligned to the different product features and levers that you have. A couple of different ones that we've seen is one, of course, is tiered pricing. This is what we usually see in typical SaaS tools. Sign up for Salesforce, you have your starter plan and your pro plan or your advanced plan. And then we see this newer type of packaging, which is pay as you go. And this is the usage based or consumption based that we've been seeing. A lot of the different cloud vendors and ad networks have popularized this. So you sign up for, Amazon web services, you're paying by the hour, or you're paying by the API call or API transaction. And there's a couple pros and cons, for these different models.
Are there any, like in your experience when you talk to people, are there any models that you are particularly, let's say, disliking or liking, like any things where you say, well, probably really not this, or like this is a really good idea? Or do you think it's really very specific to what you're doing with your API?
I would say one of the packaging models that's on the way out that I don't recommend anymore is the per CPU or per core license model. It can work in certain cases, but with serverless architecture and Docker containers and everything, it's very, very hard for you to align it to the value. And whenever you think about packaging, you should make sure that the right thing that you're pricing on is truly aligned to the value that your customers get. And at the same time, you're also able to capture that value. Now, on the flip side, one of the models I love is the pay-as-you-go pricing. And the reason is you can have a beautiful expansion model. Someone signs up with a credit card, and maybe they're just paying initially 5 cents or $50 a month, a very low amount. And that's because they're using it in like a sandbox or test environment. And as soon as they deploy that integration with your API out to production and grow their customer base, and before you know it, they're spending $1,000 a month, 5,000, 10,000. And that makes, moving to a enterprise plan far much easier when they already saw value from the API. And it's just more of a matter of, hey, let's offer you some volume discounts by moving you to an enterprise agreement. That's very different than trying to go from 0 to 1, which is, you sign up and then you suddenly have to set up some type of tier and jump, to the next level, which could be a pretty large jump for a customer. They're not necessarily ready for it.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I think, like you said, like some of the big vendors have definitely popularized this model. And I think it's something that it makes sense, and people are definitely used to it from a variety of big examples. So that always also is a big factor. Okay, now we have discussed billing, we have discussed packaging. Now we can move on to our third pillar, which is invoicing. So now that you've figured out how to do all the mechanics, now it comes to, I guess, actually getting the money. So how does that work?
Definitely. And, when we talk about invoicing strategy, this is less focused on expansion revenue and what's on with the product itself. This is usually driven from the finance team. Do they care about when do they get those payments? How do they send out those invoices? And the two models we've seen the most is what we call recurring invoice. This is what we see usually with, SaaS, where you get an invoice per month, or maybe it's per quarter or per year, whatever that periodic schedule is. And then we have a different invoicing model, which is threshold based. And this is what we usually see with, ad networks, where you spend $500, and that, as soon as you meet that $500 threshold, you get the invoice. Maybe it's credit based. So if you sign up for Twilio and you have to actually recharge your account and you buy, $100 worth of credits, and then you can keep recharging that account, but it's not aligned on any type of, periodic schedule.
And again, my question would be, do you have any preferences or any models where you would say this is probably not such a great model to go for?
Well, it's usually driven from the finance team. When we look at recurring invoice, it's much, much easier for the finance team to manage. You can deal with, recognizing the revenue correctly. It's already aligned usually on the quarter. It's more predictable. It's also predictable for customers. So if they're expecting, a consistent spend each month, then they get that invoice and they can easily see month to month how that usage or that invoice is changing. It can be complex though, especially if you have a prepaid model, and you're trying to do usage-based pricing. The other piece is it can have bad unit economics, especially for very, very low cost SaaS solutions or API solutions. For example, if it costs, 5 cents, and that's like your lowest plan, let's look at, say, Amazon's S3 or Azure Blob Storage. You have folks that might be paying 5 cents or 10 cents a month. Does it actually make sense to spend all the money on the credit card fees, which is going to be more expensive than the bill itself? And that's where these, threshold-based models might make more sense. Don't even charge the customer until they at least had, $10 worth of spend or something else.
So now that we've discussed these three pillars of billing and packaging and invoicing, are there any specific pitfalls that you could point out? Things you've seen where people are kind of stumbling or doing, you see companies doing the same mistakes, doing them over and over again. Is there anything you can share with us there?
Definitely. And the number one recommendation I have is, when it comes to developers, over communicate as much as possible. No one wants a surprise. One of the biggest surprises we see is when it comes to usage-based billing, and the bill suddenly is 5x what they saw in this month or this invoice from what they saw in the last invoice. This can easily happen when, maybe a developer is testing an API out, very low volume, maybe they're spending $50 a month. They roll it out to production, and before they know it, they used, $5,000 worth of, your API and whatever it is. And now they had to go to their manager. Maybe they had to create a purchase order because they're past some certain threshold and deal with procurement and a bunch of other stuff. So, whether it's having an email that says, you used, or maybe your usage increased by X percentage in the last week, or, you're past a certain quota or something like that. Just sending out those emails and maybe even sending a couple reminder emails is one of the first things we usually recommend folks do, especially with these usage-based models.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea, isn't it? It's some kind of transparency, right? Where you would say, well, or we have a certain model, and we know that it may create some surprises depending on your profile, but we help you dealing with those. So that's a good point, I think. Do you have any other things to look out for or to avoid?
Yeah, the other area is, developers like to do things themselves. So making as much as possible self-service. If they have to add a team member to their account, maybe they have to add their manager or someone from finance, they shouldn't have to, reach out to a support line or file a ticket. Make sure you have a self-service dashboard. Even though the product is an API, there should be some type of UI or admin console for them to log into. Similarly, if they need to track that quota, set up thresholds or when things should be sent out, provide that flexibility within, your UI itself, because, it's not a one size fit all. Some folks are perfectly fine with increased usage and they don't want a bunch of reminder emails because it's just going to go to spam or go to trash. But on the flip side, other folks are very conscious of and want to track that spend. So having a way for the developer to go in there and say, hey, once it reaches this threshold or once, the percentage goes up, send me an email and send it to my manager's email or send it to these folks.
Okay, so I think what I take away from the pitfalls you were mentioning is that you just have to avoid surprises as much as possible, communicate openly and kind of proactively, not just after kind of maybe surprising things happen. And I think that's probably, I would guess that's probably a general truth for any kind of relationship that you want to have with a customer, that you want to avoid surprises. I guess that's probably generally a good idea.
Definitely.
Derek?
And at the end of the day, these folks are people, right? And I think it's easy to forget, especially when you're working with APIs and servers and such, that there's still a person and there's an email on the other side.
Yes, that is very true. So we went through all these, I think, important pillars that we discussed now, some of the pitfalls. But I think that's before we end this, just let's take one step back and say, okay, now this is not all there is, right? This is important for monetizing APIs, but it's just kind of, I don't know, half of the story or whatever percentage that is. But are there any other recommendations you would have around like the APIs themselves, so to speak, that not just like this is how you monetize them, but this is what you should be monetizing? I think that's probably also important.
Sure, definitely. So, choosing the different, what I call the consumption metrics, and there could be a lot of different ones, is extremely important. Many times I usually recommend having at least two, but not too many, because, if you have 10 different things you're pricing on, then you have decision paralysis. I mean, you don't want, to be pricing on seats and then transactions and then 20,000 different features and a whole menu of options. It can work. There's this newer trend of doing this like a la carte model, but as long as your business model is easy to understand, it can work. But, don't send them a menu. So.
Okay, so yeah, I think that makes sense. I think that's kind of in line with your recommendation around transparency, right? Make it easy for people to understand what it is that they're even consuming. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Anything else you'd like to share with us, Derek? And then I will, so I know that you have published some blog posts around this. I will definitely add those to the description of the video so that people can check out further information about this. Do you have anything you'd like to add? Some closing thoughts, Derek?
Sure. I mean, outside of, the monetization piece, and speaking on the communication, getting a developer to adopt an API is hard. And what we usually recommend is, having different touch points and emails. These can be automated. They can be, driven from CSM, depending on, how you structure your sales org. But trying to nudge them to that next step. Because a lot of times what we see with an API program is, developers have questions. They get stuck. They run into errors with the SDK. They don't know what to do next. Maybe they sent a few transactions, but they didn't see value yet. So having the right content, sending them saying, okay, it looks, hey, congratulations, you made your first API call. Here's the next step you should do. Congratulations, it looks like you rolled this out to production. You got, 20,000 transactions made in the last month. Here's, some sales enablement material, such as a case study that you can share with your manager, or do you want to share this with someone, right? Because developers love sharing, what they did. Make them excited to be using your API.
Okay, I think that's good additional information around there. It's not just about monetization, but it's to me, what you just said is kind of almost like product management, right? Where you would say, well, I want people to like my product, I want them to feel good about my product, and there are a lot of facets to it that go beyond just the pure monetization part.
Definitely.
Okay, Derek, thanks so much for joining. I think that was really interesting. Like I said, I will link a couple of resources from the description. And thanks so much for joining. Thanks for sharing your insights into monetizing APIs. And with that, we're done for today. Thanks everybody for joining and watching. And if you liked it, please give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing. And until next time, see you. Bye.
Bye, and thank you very much, Eric.